All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I am very tempted to individually go through each person and participant list that I know and don't know and wish you a very warm welcome, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to get us rolling on this very exciting panel today because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time to hear our panelists and questions. So my name is Sarang Shah, and I am a third-year law student at Berkeley Law. I am also an editor at the LPE blog and frequent co-conspirator of the LPE project. So thank you all for joining us. As you know, we had hoped to gather in person last April 2020 for the Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. As you know, 2020 offered us a number of unexpected events. However, thanks to the patience and resilience of this community, we are thrilled to be hosting this virtual conference series. So let's get to the details. Our entire lineup of events and registration links, as well as a sneak peek at the upcoming blog symposia, are available through our website. That website is lpeproject.org. Again, that's lpeproject.org, where you can also sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. Our next event, Revival and Renewal of Marxist Approaches, with Dina Tsufala, Robert Knox, Tor Craver, Mai Taha, and Nate Holdren, an all-star lineup, if I do say so myself, will take place Thursday, March 25th, from 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. Eastern, or if you're on Pacific time like me, that's 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. So it's a little early, but I'm sure you'll all be able to make it. The LPE project is thankful to the Berkeley Law LPE chapter, which is the Law and Political Economy Society, lpesoc.org, for helping to organize this event. And today, Raul Carrillo from the LPE project will be live tweeting from the LPE project account, so keep an eye out for that. Anyways, with that bit of lead up, it is my pleasure to introduce today's student moderator, Lilly Ginsburg. So just by way of quick introduction, Lilly Ginsburg is a first-year law student at Berkeley Law and currently leading the Law and Political Economy Society at Berkeley as one of 3 members of the Society's executive board. Lilly was introduced early to LPE as an undergrad at Sarah Lawrence College and is now helping to grow and sustain LPE at Berkeley by organizing our Introduction to LPE reading group, as well as other events. So without further ado, it's my honor to share Lilly's infectious enthusiasm with LPE, for LPE with all of you. So feel free to take it away, Lilly, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarang, for that excellent introduction. Needless to say, it is a huge honor for me to be here today as well. And it has been so excellent working with you, Sarang, at the Law and Political Economy Society at Berkeley. As Sarang has already said, and as I see people doing, please feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat as people filter in. During today's event, each speaker will be afforded 10 minutes of speaking time before we move on to questions. As questions arise, please use the Q&A chat function to type them for me or the panelists to field, and please also feel free to comment on each other's questions. Without further ado, allow me to introduce today's panelists. Jed Kroenke is an associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. His research centers on international legal history and the study of alternative labor and property institutions, which include work on cooperative landholding, the role of labor and employment law in development, employee-owned corporations, comparative union democracy, and the relationship of property and labor rights in democratization. He is an active member of the Association for the Promotion of Political Economy in the Law, commonly called APPEAL, as well as an introductory associate editor for the recently launched Journal of Law and Political Economy, aka JLPE. John Cioffi is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. His current research investigates conflicts of interests as products of complex legal, political, and institutional processes that pose a persistent and insidious threat to democratic politics and the rule of law. Jamee Moudud is a professor of economics at Sarah Lawrence College, my alma mater. At the nexus of law and political economy, he focuses his research on the legal foundations of markets and money, as well as how conflicts over property and contracts are at the heart of our economic system. Jamee is on the board of Appeal and is among the co-founders of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. He sits on the editorial board of JLPE, as well as on the journal Money on the Left. Ezra Rosser is a professor of law and dean of the part-time and evening division at the American University Washington College of Law. His research focuses on poverty and on tribal economic development, and his upcoming book, A Nation Within: Navajo Land and Economic Development, will be published by Cambridge University Press later this year. And lastly, Tim Kuhner is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Auckland. His teaching and research focus on corruption, money and politics, and comparative constitutional law. His latest book, Tyranny of Greed, examines the origins and effects of Trump's presidency from the perspectives of law, economics, religion, and political science. And with that said, I'm going to hand things off to Jed Kroenke.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hope this. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so apologies for, I guess, not showing up in person and away for a Zoom with time difference changes this week, not in the office. But so my talk today, confronting varieties of economic democracy, pluralism, and anti-authoritarian legal reform. So the motivation from this project is trying to map out what sort of is happening in the moment when there is a transition from people who support the idea of sort of economic democracy quite broadly, where this was sort of marginalized politically, where there's a movement between hope and the real possibility of power, right, to implement some of these long sort of marginalized idea. And at the same time, we see in that transition some of the things I've seen more submerged in my study of things like advocacy for cooperative land trusts or employee-owned corporations, where once you sort of move from the transition, that's from the solidarity that's induced by sort of being on sort of the outside into a possible position of implementation, right? This type of pluralism and its implications become more prominent, right? And in development, this is a common phenomenon, right? When new regimes come into power, the sort of ideas that joined people together at a sort of more broader abstract level often have difficulties sort of transitioning into coherent and lasting policies. So obviously, there's a great deal traditionally written from a variety of disciplines about economic democracy and what it means. And I think part of what we're seeing now is that we don't all necessarily mean the same thing when we say economic democracy, right? There's some sort of general idea that we believe that, you know, the economic realm should be infused with democratic values and not cordoned off as sort of a separate or apolitical realm of technocracy. And at the immediate moment, when we're engaged in possible labor market and corporate governance reforms, we start to see that these sort of diverse solutions within sort of these broader social movements have sort of diverse conceptions of democracy underlying them as well. Okay? So the project here is an attempt to start a way of mapping out and thinking about these so that these ideas can be clearly articulated. So one just, you know, and these examples for the time are going to be relatively general, but if we look at like the universal basic income versus job guarantee, right? These are two popular ideas that have gained some sort of traction at a popular level. And they do in some ways have this overlapping goal, right? One of which, right, in a very straightforward fashion is to improve income security, right? Obviously, people think they have a wide range of benefits, but that at least at a baseline level is part of the popular understanding. But however, there's quite conflicted conceptions when you look at the divergent conceptions of labor, right? And underneath those two ideas, right? It's not simply how do they both better achieve income security per se, but the idea of under UBI, right, a freedom from labor is often quite distinct from those promoting job guarantees, where in the tradition of labor as like a meaning generating or community building type of exercise, right? And so we start to see people's view of participation in groups and the workplace diverge under whether or not these conceptions beyond income security as a material fact are what sort of motivating their support for these ideas. Okay. Another realm in which we can see this emerging at the moment, right? Stakeholder governance, right? Revising theories of corporate governance versus employee ownership, right? Of corporations. These both have, again, a similar overlapping goal about improving or transforming corporate decision-making, but they have quite different concepts of where that sort of modification is derived from, right? Employee ownership, largely an ownership rights. This is directly tied to traditional forms of share ownership. And stakeholder governance having an ideal of sort of community impact, right? Those who participate, right, are part of the groups of people impacted by corporate decision making that's not tied to any specific ownership right. Okay, so in these, even though there would sort of be sort of common travelers in a way, you start to see that the property-based sort of institutionalism of those who support employee ownership, is specifically like ESOPs, and the sort of deliberative participatory view of the grounds of economic democracy by those promoting stakeholder governance start to then conflict at the point of prioritizing reforms under these rubrics. Right? So in many ways, what we start to see is that the controversies of political democratic theory now come to economic democracy, right? I think once, again, coming from the margins, everyone thinks economic democracy is great. If you think economic democracy is great, right, you are my ally in a way, but there's a lot of unresolved issues, right? I think one of the things that's classically at play, right, direct democracy versus Republican representation, right? So the idea, like in many forms of cooperative production, right, of having sort of flat, non-hierarchical forms of corporate organization versus people working through how to sort of implement these ideas, but through things like indirect representation in much larger scaled entities, right? These are not just pragmatic issues, but these are issues of the nature of the democracy that people are imagining. So this gets into, you know, these types of things that on the political democratic theory sides have been longstanding issues, right? How do you structure voting, right? One person, one vote in of itself, right, doesn't resolve a whole lot of issues. So how do you manage hierarchy, majoritarianism, or even apathy? Okay, and this is one of there are a variety of areas, especially if you look at you know, antitrust, where this idea of small is still beautiful. A lot of people have an idea that the view of economic democracy that they have is embedded with their view of sort of local democracy, right, which is not necessarily shared by proponents who have ideas of hierarchy and Republican representation as part of their imagination. So I think one of the things that this makes clear is that sort of democracy at work creates its own problems, right? One thing is to sort of think through in this is that while we may have sort of conceptions of how this works in practice, there's a lot of details that need to be worked out, right? In the corporate governance world, people often say you've had 100 years to work out sort of manager, owner, agency issues, and these types of things come up in the workplace as well, right? So the idea that was sort of longstanding that having more democratic participation at work would lead to sort of more sort of political, or even in some ways by some metrics, better political participation, right, has been empirically difficult to substantiate. And you can imagine, right, there are incentives to externalize costs to the larger community if you are, right, more empowered and more invested and especially in the non-diversified context in your workplace, right? The idea that necessarily you would think about others just because you're empowered locally in your own life is something that doesn't necessarily happen so easily. right? Then we have to deal with horizontal forms of oppression, right? In the cooperative literature, this is quite clear, right? The idea of like, even if you don't have hierarchies, right? There are lots of things that happen in the workplace socially where there's new forms of oppression that aren't necessarily managerial in nature. And then fundamentally, right, that people have high levels of heterogeneity in their participation preferences. Not everyone wants to be involved in a workplace dynamic where they have to be involved in decision-making or that they want to sort of collaborate. People talk about this in the cooperative context as like emotional labor, right? There's lots of people who may want to just sort of punch their clock and get out of work. And so I think what the larger aim of the project is, if we think about how economic authoritarians have sort of worked to preserve power, right? They've sort of had this combination of effective narrative storytelling, which I think has also been, part of the tradition of the critical left, but also functional reforms, right? Things that at least based upon their own metrics like work. And they're able to use hierarchy and discipline in a way of sort of bridging the sort of solidarity, pluralism divide in ways that has been classically difficult for the left to mirror. And so in this project, one of the things that I sort of import from my work on development is this sort of the fear, right, of what the consequence can be of gaining power without having worked through some of these issues, right? So this type of utopianism and the liability of discrediting reforms, right? The idea that it's easy to do things differently. A new regime comes into power. It implements a wide range of reforms, often traditionally involving nationalization. It doesn't work out, right? And it leads to sort of like a cyclical shift in regimes once again, right? So I think a lot of the sort of optimism that's necessary to sustain the hope of being marginalized politically, right, has to give way to some sort of cynicism and design seriousness about the institutions that are going to be implemented in labor and governance reform, right? And I think as another classic issue is, right, acting as if politics operates as which we think it should, right? If we have a sort of very high opinion of how people potentially can operate in the workplace, and we don't sort of look at some of the sort of more cynical lessons imported from other disciplines, we may be sort of falling into that particular hole of these things not working out in practice. Okay, all right, so I think 9.5 minutes, that's as fast as I could get through that. Also, just as a plug, since this is being recorded, I get a lot of questions being in Hong Kong. It's very difficult to be part of the critical left and know what to think about what's going on in Hong Kong. So I'm just gonna give one link here for people to look at perspectives from the critical left in that context where I think even some of these issues are at play. All right, that's it.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jed. So I think that we have John up next, if you're all ready, John.
Okay, let me pull up my PowerPoint and find out where.
Yeah, perfect. And this is a good opportunity just to remind maybe new participants that if any questions should come up, please feel free to put them into the Q&A chat function, and everyone should feel free to respond to those questions, whether it's panelists or other participants.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here and an honor. I thank the organizers for all their very hard work in putting this together, making it possible. Just by way of introduction, I am in a political science department, but before going off to law school, I was a practicing lawyer. So my work has continued to bridge law and political economy, and it was a very lonely place to be for a very long time. And the LPE project is one of the most wonderful developments in academia I've seen in years. So I'm very happy to be part of this. Now, this presentation really follows nicely on Jed's, since I take issues of design, institutional design, policy design, organizational design very seriously. And as the subject matter of this talk indicates, I take the flaws and very deeply rooted and foundational flaws of those designs very seriously. And this work comes out of my prior work on comparative corporate governance and political economy, but also bearing witness to the pervasive and protracted economic crises over the last 15 to 20 years, which only seem to become deeper and worse over time. And looking at how they unfolded, what their origins were, their effects, their consequences, I began to see common patterns that there were these foundational conflicts of interest that afflicted power relations on both the private sector side and the public sector side, that generated concentrations of power and interacted with one another in distinctive ways that produced self-destructive dynamics on the most advanced industrialized capitalist countries. And this was quite striking, since we're seeing this kind of historical process of conflicts, which for many decades we had thought of as, the fate of the developing world or non-developing world, and coming closer and closer to the core until in 2007, 2008, it hits the United States. And we have the global financial crisis, which I tell my students is probably the most successful export the United States has had in 40 years. Now, one of the things about conflicts of interest that made them especially appealing to me, other than the fact that I'm seeing them crop up in consequential ways all over the place, is that it really bridges the study of law and political economy in an important and meaningful way. I don't think you can understand conflicts of interest or the effects that they have in generating crises without doing both. And the study of conflicts of interest in particular has been largely dominated by legal academia, and it's largely marginalized into the studies of public and private corruption. And one of the things that I've noted is that in their most consequential form, conflicts of interest tend to be legal, not illegal. In fact, they are largely legally constituted. If we think of constitutional designs, if we think of the corporation as an institutional form, we think of the administrative state. These are legally constituted structures, and they're riddled with conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest are the source, not only ex ante of concentrated forms of power, the power resources that accrue to privileged parties within those structures tends to grow over time. It's kind of a recursive feedback effect. So the big questions are, why are all the prevailing national models of capitalism becoming so profoundly dysfunctional, and why have they not responded functionally to these deepening crises? And much of the answer, not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but much of it can be teased out by looking at the configuration of conflicts of interest within different systems of governance. So, as an even kind of deeper level, there's a real paradox of conflicts of interest in capitalism, that it's widely recognized that conflicts of interest are a fundamental problem. They must be policed, they must be contained. Yet very often they are marginalized in the way I was talking about before. But the paradox is that capitalist modernity and rationalism and institutional designs and the division of labor have produced a proliferation of conflicts of interest. So functional specialization, increasing interdependency of actors, the development of institutional and professional gatekeepers, what some people call flexions, as a category of elite that rotate between the high end of the private and public sectors. And all of these are fashioned by capitalist modernity, and they become the engines of increasingly severe conflicts of interest that begin to distort the structure and operation of the entire political economic system. So from that perspective, conflicts of interest are not these kind of, incidental byproducts or exceptional deficiencies in practice, but are constitutive building blocks of political economies. And therefore, they are foundational not only to how political economies function, but how they dysfunction over time. And they contain this characteristic of feedback effects that tends to accelerate the increasing concentration of power, and to some extent the insulation of power from accountability that's destabilizing, potentially transformative, and also has a tendency to generate severe crisis. So I think it's worthwhile to have a definition on hand. And one of the striking things when you start delving into the literature on conflicts of interest is there's really a lack of consensus and a basic definition, which perhaps is not too surprising because conflicts of interest are so pervasive and take so many forms across social, political, and economic order. But here's a reasonably good one. That a conflict of interest is a situation in which an individual entrusted with a certain mission and a certain sphere of action and the interest associated with it will peddle that authority and discretion for that reason of information and access in this sphere to gain advantage, obtain control and influence in another sphere of action. Now that's quite abstract, and given the variety and variation of conflicts of interest, it needs to be somewhat abstract in order to contain everything we're talking about. But as a general descriptive matter, in the characteristics of conflicts of interest are a relationship of trust and or reliance, asymmetric knowledge, expertise, information, access, and therefore power, and the vulnerability of the entrusting power. Most commonly thought of, vulnerability to rent seeking. It's a short-term distributional harm, or the more consequential vulnerability, which is disadvantage in agenda setting and policy outcomes, which is a long-term structural form of disadvantage and harm, and is the flip side of this aggregation and concentration of power due to the initial conflicts of interest in the institutional order of capitalism. Also, frequently you see that conflicts of interest are framed in individualist terms, which is classic attribute of liberal political and economic theory, and therefore legal theory. But of course, the parties may be individuals, they may be collective entities or institutions in their own right. And as I said before, the conflicts I'm interested in are not the things that are legally prohibited. I'm interested in the conflicts that are legally constituted, or as the common saying goes, the real scandal is what's legal. And what is legal is often assumed as the natural order of things and the inevitable status quo. And we need to interrogate and look at that and how our problems are rooted in what we assume to be the natural order of things. Now, what is often
hey, John, just want to note you've got about a minute left.
Okay, so then I'm going to jump forward. So when we're talking about conflicts of interest in the institutional order, I think of them as constitutive. They actually are building blocks of the order, and they constitute the actors and institutional powers that they wield. So first, these conflicts are institutional phenomenon. Two, they're often enshrined and enabled by law. And three, they generate these feedback loops that dynamically alter power relations and promote aggregations of power. So and I just want to end on this note of conflicts of interest and feedback effects, because one of the things I'm also dealing with at the academic level is the tendency of social scientists and institutional theorists in particular to theorize about stability and resilience and stickiness. The notion of path dependence as constraining change. And one of the things that characterizes feedback loops and including conflicts of interest and power relations is they're nonlinear. So we don't have this nice, predictable, smooth path of development. We could have some, parabolic changes in the distribution of wealth, the distribution of income, and the distribution of power that then presents the possibility of systemically transformative change. And in recent decades, those changes have tended to be negative. They have tended to promote plutocracy over democracy, chasms of inequality yielding both social decay and economic dysfunction, and undermines both democratic governance and the rule of law, since concentrations of power are antithetical to both democracy and rule of law issues. And as a consequence, as a matter of the implications, we not only need to see conflicts of interest as sources of dynamic, transformative trends that are legally constructed, we have to start looking at their reform through the lens of power relations. Reforms that do not fundamentally take on issues of power are ineffectual. If the problem is one of power, then the solution must also be one of power. And in that respect, I look back to John Kenneth Galbraith in the early 1950s, who wrote that a functional capitalist democracy, or any democracy, is premised on countervailing power. One of the problems in that generation of scholars and those who followed them is they thought that would emerge spontaneously. As we now know, to our chagrin, it doesn't. It must be actively pursued. And to harken back to Jed's comments, we have to take issues of institutional design very seriously, and how they actually work in dynamic fashion across time, if we don't want to end up in the same hole we're currently in. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John. And just before we move on to Jamee, I do believe that John said that these slides will be made available later on. Was that the case, John?
Yes, I'll email you. You can post them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with
Thank
that, we'll move on to Jamee. Perfect.
Thank you. So I always amuse myself by introducing myself as a dissenting heterodox economist, because, well, you will see as I go into my talk. And for me, this LPE family has been, this ecosystem has been truly inspirational. It's been my home for several years now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share with you a particular research project, which actually focuses on the question of institutional design and brings in questions of power and put it in the context of globalization, right? Now, the fact that there are varieties of capitalism incorporating different institutional frameworks is relatively uncontroversial in terms of the literature. The question is, how does one understand these variants of capitalism and what do they imply for globalization? Now, the conventional discourse on these types of issues is couched in terms of the purported existence of market failures that may or may not justify state intervention. I put this term state intervention in quotes because I actually don't believe there's any such thing. My point is that dichotomies such as market failures versus perfectly competitive markets, state intervention versus laissez-faire, free trade versus protectionism, and so on are not only theoretically incoherent, they also occlude the possibility of alternative social and industrial policies that also have the benefit of being based on ample historical evidence. So I just want to say, I don't want to, sort of get into the details of free trade theory. That's all in the paper. But the whole business with free trade is based on a set of assumptions straight out neoclassical microeconomics. Perfect competition, full employment, and free trade leads to balanced trade, and so forth. And so if at any point in time, any country is actually running trade surpluses, Japan in the 1980s, 1970s, China in the current moment, that's immediately targeted as cheating. So this becomes the default way of thinking for both conservatives and many liberals too, right? Because the benchmark framework is the view that there should be balanced trade. And this, of course, has been weaponized famously or notoriously by the far right, as you know. Cheating has been tied to xenophobia and attacks against all kinds of attacks against Japan and China and so on. In this paper, I ground my analysis on the rejection of this notion of market failure and its twin perfect markets, because the notion of market failure is utterly incoherent. It makes no sense whatsoever. It has as its basis this notion of a perfect market, perfect competition, which is utterly at odds with reality. And so I reflect in this paper on the possibility of conceptualizing what some authors have called a high road to globalization or to global integration, as opposed to the neoliberal one, whose failures are well known and well exploited by the far right in this country and elsewhere. Think about Brexit, right? Now, in my work, I draw on two traditions, both going back to the early 20th century. One is the work of a team of economists at Oxford, called the Oxford Economist Research Group, and especially the work of a man called Philip Andrews, who were really looking at the question of what does a firm actually do? And this work was survey-based, based on a survey-based methodology, in which actual business people were asked, what is it that you do in terms of pricing, in terms of investment and all this? And what they found was quite remarkably that what these business people were telling them was completely at odds with what they were teaching in their own textbooks in microeconomics. So this led to the rejection of perfect competition and its opposite, which is imperfect competition. And that imperfect competition is at the heart of what is called market failure. Price setting behavior and cost cutting were central features of all firms, though obviously some are more successful than others. Price setting to determine cash flow to finance investments. So the notion of the firm as a going concern, this was a term that John R. Commons, the famous institutional economist, coined. So there was an interesting parallel between the work of Andrews and Commons. Now, this only deals with what firms actually do. Then there is a further question, what are firms? And this is where I become a dissenting heterodox economist, because economics, even heterodox economics, has nothing to say about that. So there I go to the legal realists. And in my work, I evoke the notion of what I call the constitutional theory of the business enterprise, which considers the firm as a political creature, which is embedded in particular socio-political and legal contexts. So that implies that the firm is itself a part of that structure as it attempts to shape it, the owners of the firm or whoever wields power in the firm. Okay? So my work has both micro and macro implications. the analysis of business investment, not just in economics, but also its political and legal foundations. And so part of this work is also a challenge against law and economics, right? Which focuses on neoclassical microeconomics. So my work tends to focus a lot on the firm because I think that coming from the left, a key piece of critical left thinking has to push back against the central assumptions, core models of neoclassical economics, which is the theory of the business enterprise. So what I do in this paper is to suggest that the constitution of the business enterprise can be used as a way to consider varieties of industrial and social policies. Arguing against austerity programs, a number of authors have argued that there could be a high road to globalization with improved trade performance and economic security, as opposed to the low road one. There are a number of countries I discuss in the paper, both in the global south and in the global north, that have managed to do just that. So this is not just, sort of abstract pie in the sky talk. Once one understands that business costs and investment assets are the consequences of background laws and politics, Martha McCluskey says that all costs have rights built into them, and that those background laws and politics act through the, so essentially those costs act through the law, could be involved in reconstructing markets and business investment by redistributing coercive powers within the economy, potentially reducing economic insecurity, labor market insecurity, that these become possibilities. And of course, the role of mobilizing finance through the central bank and or public banks can become a key lever in selectively disciplining and incentivizing corporations or other forms of business entities. Now, are these pie in the sky ideas? And the answer is no. The history of capitalism has shown over and over again successful efforts by social and labor and environmental movements in pushing back against capitalist prerogatives. Right? And I provide evidence in the paper from countries both in the global south and the north that there is no mechanical link between trade performance and human development. Thus, there are possibilities of creating new forms of industrial and social policies in the global economy that depend neither on protectionism nor rely on the fatal notion of free trade. So we have to break out of that kind of thinking. Right? Now, of course, I'm not naive enough to believe that such a progressive strategy will be easy or even straightforward, given the pushback from industry that such an initiative will receive. But there's also a deeper issue, which is more insidious and powerful. And I think this kind of resonates with what's been said before. And that is the embeddedness of power relations. For example, the revolving door between the public and private sectors, and something that I think a lot about, which is the shared commonality of ideas, the belief systems, faith in the neoclassical model that have real world performative consequences, right? So a crucial question arises for me: how is the legal and political framework to be created, given these obstacles, to reach the high road and be maintained along it? Now, I hope this is a conversation we can have in this panel. Suffice to say here that the framework I've laid out here hopefully displaces the almost panopticon style role that market forces play in conventional discourse, with little room for maneuver in the prison yard of the market. But if you're going to move that prison yard beyond the prison yard, we have to obviously reckon with the varieties of power relations, institutionalized and such, which construct the boundaries, which then naturalize the economic system which we live in, and which, with all the negative consequences that we see, the devastation around us, which has been so skillfully exploited by fascism and fascist movements in the 21st century. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamee. And I think up next we have Ezra.
You're muted.
There I go. Sorry about that. I'm very thankful to be invited to talk with you on this panel. And I was thinking about the connection, and it's hard to see sometimes the connection across these things, especially when we get to my paper. But a couple things that have already been said really do connect with what I'm going to be talking about. So one is the embeddedness of the power relations that we just heard about. And the other was on John's note about the natural order of things. It's exciting to be on a panel where we're not just doing what I think law professors generally do, which is tinker at the margins and actually talk about bigger topics. I was worried in part about my talk being too broad, but it appears that either I found my people or you guys will decide I'm too narrow. With that said, let me say a couple thoughts about what I want to talk about. The main thing, and this goes with the introducing myself part, at most talks, people don't really remember too far after the talk. And so I want to say what I want you to remember. And that is that I care a lot about poverty law. I also care about Navajo economic development within the property space. And I think this does go with the last talk as well. I largely argue for destabilizing property, for undercutting some of the security that people have in property. The challenge, I will note, is that this can show up as in odd ways. And so in the talk that I'm doing today, and I'm putting the links right in the chat, it's actually somewhat conservative. And that's very hard for me to think that I'm writing a paper that resonates with conservative thought in some ways. So let me just talk briefly about this. This is an image from Euclid, not from Euclid, of Cleveland, of Euclid Avenue, which runs to the city of Euclid. And it shows, I think, well, the connection between Euclid, the city, which eventually becomes the foundation for zoning in America, and the city that eventually blocked that. So the Supreme Court affirmed the power of a locality in Euclid to deny the power of zoning in the larger metropolitan area to spread in its natural way. And within that case, there's a brief note where it says that in some circumstances, if regional need is great enough, the local power to zone will be trumped by larger state or regional needs. And so that's really what I'm talking about, is when it is that we need to no longer defer to local zoning. The most famous example of this is Mount Laurel. In Mount Laurel, a city eventually had to build public housing. This is a younger version of me in front of Ethel Lawrence. Ethel Lawrence is somebody that's not well known, but I think this book makes a very good claim that she deserves status up there with Rosa Parks on the housing and the challenge to sort of white exclusion that was happening in Jersey. I'm not the only one that said it. Nestor Davidson has talked in a recent article about the need to take into account this limitation on the local zoning. I love his article. I think the tightrope he's walking is that we sort of, as progressives, want to deny local government when they are acting against people, but also to encourage them or support them when they're acting in favor of groups that are otherwise vulnerable. But obviously the setting for this, and this is what makes me uncomfortable, and I will say myself, is that the main people that have written about the ways in which regulations limit supply are conservatives. And so Robert Ellickson at Yale has written a lot about regulation and how it impacts supply. His two most recent articles, I think, are very well done for the ways in which, and they include Woodbridge, which is a suburb of New Haven, zones out and makes impossible construction for anything other than protected, largely white, largely upper class people to live there. Another article, Vicky Bean and others, directly attacks or deals with the fact that some on the left are skeptical about any supply argument because they point out that new units won't necessarily filter down, right? The filtering model is very slow. And the other concern, of course, is gentrification. And so because of all of this, there is a note among some academics that the attacks on zoning have become the elite libertarian consensus. And that hurts, right? I don't see myself as that. I see myself as sort of left of everyone else doing property. But Nevertheless, I think there is a chance for some sort of reconciliation between the right and the left when it comes to supply with regard to housing. So progressive property scholars, and I would include among those liberals, but also generally the academic establishment, and then some that are further left, and conservative property scholars, which has a broad category. I think they are both concerned, or at least they express concern about the cost of housing and the lack of development of new units. In the chat, I posted the National Low Income Housing Coalition's report, which says that no state has enough supply for people to live in, right? Especially people that are working class or below. So on the left, I think the left needs to acknowledge being wrong a little bit, or having been wrong in not paying as much attention to supply as it relates to new construction. There have been attention to supply, but largely in declining cities or cities facing the threat of gentrification, but less attention to supply with development. And on the right, I think there's, and this is just my own skepticism, I see the right as often proclaiming a concern for the poor, but it's not actually clear to me that that's true. And so I would love to see the right actually demonstrate that they do care about the poor, rather than just using it as a rhetorical device to attack liberals or progressives. So there are all sorts of limitations on local zoning, and there's also work being done to undermine those limitations, especially in the state level. And John and Frank in particular has written about this. Some cities are developing in the United States accessory dwelling units as a matter of right. And you saw in Berkeley that Berkeley recently announced it's doing away with single family home zoning. So there have been moves to essentially allow greater density. Obviously, the concern is that this is really being driven more by middle class and upper middle class concerns about home pricing, rather than for the lower class and the poor. But it still is a sign that something is afoot. And at Yale, Anika Lamar has done a good job, I think, showing somewhat odd places where you don't expect it. So I think in the housing space, we all know that there are state efforts to allow some sort of mobile home or modular construction, but it's also in things like daycares, group homes, and even split solar or distributed renewable energy. So there are concerns about this. One of the concerns is by Chris Serkin, and he basically says that cities are back and now you're going to kill it, right? So for a long time, the concern was that cities were sort of where the poor were, and they had to fight that for a long period of time. And now just when they become attractive, you're going to do something to make them less attractive. They're attractive, in other words, and even says this because they've been providing stability for owners that buy into the city, and they also have some of the same exclusionary values that have managed for a long time to make the suburbs attractive for the wealthy and the upper middle class. And another concern that I think is much more salient with me, at least I think makes this a much harder case, is one by Rick Schrager, who says that there are progressive cities and you don't want to weaken cities. 2 minutes, I'll go quick, but you don't want to weaken cities just when we're seeing some of their power, right? And we see that on things like immigration, but also the fight for 15. And so there is a danger there in going to state level solutions and state level deregulation to increase supply, when otherwise cities may be, in fact, the locus for progressive politics. My own take on this, and then the last one, sorry, is gentrification. Gentrification is huge in DC, where I am. It's huge across the country. There are sort of two responses to that. One is there are lots of places where it's not huge, but where academics tend to be in the United States are very much cities on the coast facing gentrification. And the other is the harder argument. It's more just an empirical. Does new development cause gentrification? And I think the challenge that we have so far is that we think of new development and we think of those gentrifying areas, but my argument is that the focus, just to pick DC, should not be on Shaw or Howard, where we're seeing gentrification. It should be on the continued protection of places like Spring Valley and AU Park that never have to face new density, because we're going to protect the homeowners there in their single family homes. All of this is, of course, nothing new. Cheryl Cashin wrote about this a while ago. Regional issues have been on the plate for a very long time. It is salient. So Trump, of course, towards the end of his presidency said, we need to protect the suburban lifestyle dream of the of people. And this was in the context of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, but it is larger than that. My own inclination, which I conclude at the end, is that yes, there are arguments on both sides, and we can never forget about, of course, affordable housing. This does not solve the affordable housing crisis, but we can make progress on this. And so that's where I end up. I'll say in the last 10 seconds, for those of you who get a chance to read it, I think the main value for most readers is the summaries I do of other people's work. So if you're not in this space and not, but you want to, I do think that's the good part of my article. The actual conclusion is a much harder call. So I look forward to people disagreeing with. That's
Perfect. Thank you, Ezra. I just studied Mount Laurel and property the other day. So lastly, we have Tim.
Hi. Thanks for being here, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, beautiful. I want to address some general ideas of law and political economy and some general ideas of social democracy. And then I want to tie those to key 21st century challenges and how those challenges require a foundational change that's legal and ideological in the law of democracy, especially electoral law, but the law of democracy more generally. So the conference materials that we have online talk about concrete institutional barriers to democracy under neoliberalism. The conference webpage includes mention in that regard of legal configurations of property, markets, economic development, political representation, campaign finance, corporations, labor unions, banking, and international trade agreements. It's a pretty lengthy list, but each one of those items deserves to be on there. That list reminds me of a concept in Thomas Piketty's latest book, Capital and Ideology, which is an inequality regime. Piketty calls or defines an inequality regime as a set of discourses and institutional arrangements that justify and structure the economic, social, and political inequalities of a given society. And we are very familiar with those inequalities in terms of economic inequality and gender inequality and political inequality and so on. Inequalities between nations, of course, as well, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, et cetera. Okay, so in order to abolish an inequality regime, many areas of law and society have to be transformed. And that would include, and this is a similarly big list, alongside the ingredients of that inequality regime, the list of things that has to be transformed include political and economic ideologies, the educational regime and knowledge sharing, property ownership, taxation, corporate law, and the global economy, global political collaboration, and environmental justice. So again, a really massive context for this conversation occurring over many panels about law and political economy, because what we're talking about really are wide-ranging structural changes that have to be worked out through political mobilization and experimentation. And what I think all of us are doing in participating in these kinds of discussions is something that precedes that political mobilization and experimentation, or at least the experimentation part. It might not precede the mobilization part. It's probably bound up with that. But what I think we're involved in here is knowledge production relating to structural foundational shifts in law and political economy. What kind of mobilization and experimentation should we pursue? Well, of course, it depends on the state of knowledge. And I think that's where Yale's and Berkeley's programs on law and political economy fit into that sort of broader social struggle. So what's political economy all about? I think the conventional definition of political economy is similar to Alan Drazen's, where he says political economy reflects the belief that economics is not really separable from politics, and that political factors are crucial in determining economic outcomes. So that's a kind of a causal direction, right? That political factors are crucial in determining economic outcomes. And the context for that causal relationship that we're working in now in the 21st century in advanced democracies, the context for that is, of course, private control of the means of production. And when we say private control over the means of production, we conventionally mean economic production, right? It's a definition of capitalism, really, to say factories, machines, natural resources, corporations, property, intellectual property, et cetera, are all privately owned. And that's kind of axiomatic, right? Now, the results of that private ownership, however, and the way that private ownership plays out in each context that I listed depends on politics, right? So that's the conventional sense of what political economy is all about. I think social democracy is the key case for that, because social democracy allows private ownership of the means of political production, but it considers the economy as being embedded in the broader social order. So it would still be the task of states to guarantee economic and social rights. It would still be the task of governments to institute economic regulations, workplace safety, minimum wages, pollution controls, possibly creative forms of corporate ownership, co-ops, co-determination, whatever. But that's the conventional piece, right? So political factors are crucial in determining economic outcomes. If you live in a laissez-faire kind of libertarian governmental order, then you're going to get much more economic inequality out of your private ownership of the means of production. Okay, but there's another facet to political economy, which is the part that I think might be causal and more foundational. So more causal, more foundational than the first component. And that's the opposite formulation. So we could define political economy as the recognition that political factors are crucial in determining economic outcomes. Well, let's flip that around. And I would say economic factors or economic outcomes are crucial in determining political outcomes. I'm interested in the sense in which all of that economic inequality can turn around and capture the state. So I don't think the relationship there is unidirectional, and neither does social democracy, and neither do social democratic theorists. So when we talk about economic factors being crucial in determining political outcomes, that's another form of private control. So it's not private control over the means of economic production, and this is where I think we're getting the name of our panel. It's private control over the means of political production, right? So private control over the means of political production would include an economic marketplace for campaign and party financing. It would include mostly privately financed elections, which of course determine the composition of government. It would include unregulated or sort of poorly regulated lobbying and conflicts of interest, which affect law and policy making. And similarly, conflicts of interest in terms of just overall public office holders' conception of how public power should be used and for what ends. So social democracy says that the private control over the means of economic production has to be regulated. The piece that I don't think is nearly as well known is that social democracy says private control over the means of political production has to be abolished. Now, so the abolition of private control over the means of political production is what my paper is about. And I think that's an emerging consensus in unusual places. You know, it's not just social democrats talking about this. It's not just progressive politicians or Bernie Sanders or AOC talking about this. It's also Transparency International in 2019 changing its definition of corruption to include the undue political influence of money in politics. It's also the UN Development Program in its 2019 report noting, for example, I'll just give you the key message of the entire 350-page document. The final key message in the UNDP 2019 Human Development Report is that we can redress inequalities if we act now before imbalances in economic power are politically entrenched. And that, I think, is what has been consolidated in this young 21st century of ours, and probably before, but certainly by now, economic power is politically entrenched. And I think the key policy issue, which is also a legal issue and an ideological issue, is how to separate that economic power from the levers of political power. So social democrats had ideas about that over 100 years ago. One example is Karl Kautsky, who insisted that lawmaking bodies were in fact a tool of class domination, but that didn't have to be the case. He wrote that whenever the proletariat engages in parliamentary activity as a self-conscious class, parliamentarianism begins to change its character. Instead of a mere tool in the hands of the bourgeoisie, organized parliamentary activity could become the most powerful lever to raise the proletariat out of its economic, social, and moral degradation. How would those legal changes, how would parliamentary or congressional activity have to be transformed in order for it to be emancipatory in that sense? Well, Kautsky says the influence of a class within a parliament depends on the nature of the electoral law in force. Edward Bernstein, who's probably my favorite in this social democracy tradition, spoke of the abolition of class government. He understood that there was a power structure bound up with democracy, which was codependent on the economic power structure bound up in capitalism. So I know I'm just about out of time. I just want to flag 3 21st century issues that I think this really relates to, and I'll stop after I just flag those and maybe leave any of those for discussion. The first is obviously extreme levels of economic inequality that have risen from the 1970s onward. And the people who track those levels of economic inequality say that they're not natural and they're not inevitable, rather they're driven by law and policy. Then you get people like Gillens and Page and Theda Skocpol saying, yeah, well, of course, democratically elected governments produce political conditions favorable to wealth concentration because they're accountable to and representative of the wealthy, right? Because economic production and political production are privately controlled. Another 21st century issue, obviously, is probably the biggest one, is climate change. And looking at climate change denial, that's an economic market. That's funded by fossil fuels companies, and they've succeeded in convincing meaningful portions of many democratic electorates to deny climate change. And then another 21st century issue, obviously, is rising illiberal populism. And those populist leaders tend to rise to power under the same recipe of claiming that the prior regime was corrupt, that democratic elites and the rule of law and campaign finance and systemic corruption. And they're right about a lot of that. But the trouble is that populist leaders are themselves even more corrupt. But all of that economic inequality and political inequality provides the foundation for illiberal populism and authoritarianism. So when I'm looking across these 21st century issues and I'm thinking about structural change, I think the reality is that democracy is incomplete. We've abolished political domination and exclusion on the basis of, we've tried on the basis of race and sex and ethnicity, but we never made those structural steps in constitutional amendments and entrenched constitutional provisions to prevent political exclusion on the basis of socioeconomic status. So that's the idea that I want to leave you all with. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been such an excellent discussion so far. And I wanted to open the room for the panelists to engage with each other before I read out some of the questions from the Q&A. And alongside that, I do have my own question that I will post in the chat because it has a few moving parts. Oh, can I do that? Okay, well, maybe actually I can.
You can't put it in the Q&A, but you can put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so, okay, sorry, yeah, I don't, okay. So I am going to post the short version, but generally I'm coming from the vantage point as a leftist that came into progressive politics at a moment when the left itself is in disarray or a state of disunification. Jed, your scholarship is focused on the need to move from solidarity about the need for change to addressing the divisions that exist between individuals who acknowledge that need for change, but have different ideas and priorities when it comes to imbuing economic institutions with democratic values. And many of the topics discussed today, the need for conceptual shifts was emphasized, for example, by shattering pervasive false dichotomies. Alongside those conceptual shifts, there is also broad recognition that we must fundamentally restructure markets in a variety of contexts, for example, by rejecting traditional zoning in favor of state approaches to housing development. Those restructurings, however, require solidarity and broad-based coalition, but especially given Jamee's insight that fundamental restructurings of markets involve a confrontation with entrenched interests that will not passively absorb progressive policies. What role do the panelists see for the conceptual shifts they discussed in helping to realize many of the radical reforms or progressive policies that are being proposed? And what advice more broadly do the panelists have for those of us who are working to unite the left on the basis of shared democratic values?
I'm reminded of the kinds of questions that Lilly used to pose in the seminars she took with me. And yeah, maybe I'll let others respond first.
Sure. I'll jump in just at the beginning. And when people were talking about what sort of links these things together in a sense is that, at least for my project, people need to have an idea of what their concept of democracy is. Right. I think that's part of what happens is that people use these terms and there's an underspecification where they don't confront these issues up front until they start competing on the policy level. And I think that's why I started with the UBI job guarantee. It's all of a sudden people started looking around saying that, well, your way of thinking about this fundamental issue, right? We have this hugely problematic way in which like labor employment operates, in which labor markets operate, but your solution is totally different. And you imagine fundamentally a different way in which labor operates in people's lives. So I think one of the things that people can do is one to think through that, like what is my real view of economic democracy in a concrete sense? I think secondarily, and in the Q&A this came up as a comparativist, right? One of it's really important, especially if you want to there's like the classics, or you can deconstruct and destabilize false binaries in the reconstruction, right? We're not looking with like tabula rasa, right? There's a lot of examples out there in other places where people have tried and failed in a variety of these ways. And I think when it comes to institutional design at this point in human history, like you have to have some sort of ability to engage with all the other experiments that have happened in other places. And I think especially like Ezra's discussion, and part of why I was attracted to study cooperative land trust is that this issue of like essentially like party discipline, when you find these really stark divides, like the idea of like localist democracy versus other forms is really like ties people up and how they think about these things. And it often leads to unarticulated sort of contests about, I thought you were my ally, you're not really my ally. What do I do from there? Because I think there's a bigger enemy out there, but I don't know how to deal with our particular differences. And I think that's the challenge, right? Once we get to this point, at some point, someone is going to have to understand that their particular and favorite sort of reform that they've been pushing for maybe 30 years at this point from the margins is not going to be the one that's adopted, and they still have to be on board with other, not just sort of non-reformist reforms, but like radical reforms. And I think that's a conversation that requires a lot of sort of explicit articulation of these ideas. Otherwise, it's sort of just going to bog down into sort of more factionalism, given the current possibilities that are out there.
Okay.
Oh, so I feel like one piece of the puzzle, and it is a piece of the puzzle, right, which is the question of a broad left strategy against what we see is obviously a series of crises that Tim was talking about, is, ideas about the economy, and I feel like so much of the outcomes of what happens as a consequence of the economy are not really challenged because they're seen as natural outcomes, market forces and all the rest of it. This is so part of our language. And so I feel like, so if you think about something like inequality, and the fact that there's nothing natural about the growing inequality from the 1970s, inequality had declined in the previous 30 years, right? but I think that in order to bring about change, there's got to be a change at the ideational level, yeah, in the sense that denaturalizing markets, denaturalizing the distribution of income, and really realizing that it's always been politics. And again, I always tell this to my students, and I've said this to you too. I mean, I have no problems talking about socialism, none whatsoever. But I think the problem is that oftentimes people fall into this trap of thinking that, well, you know, here are all these terrible things that are happening in capitalism, and the only option is either the free market or socialism. And I'm saying that that's the kind of dichotomy that leaves intact the neoclassical construction of capitalism. And I'm saying that that is the problem right there. Not that we shouldn't talk about socialism, but that we should have a more serious conversation about capitalism. And I think for that to happen, obviously lots of work needs to be done, but I feel like that's got to be the basis of this left strategy.
I have just a quick thought, which isn't, one thought is Unger, in his book on democracy from I think around 2000 and progressive move, it says that he makes this point that it's about the direction, and that we need the direction is what matters, and we shouldn't be so tied up in precisely identifying the end goal, and that the left wrongly focuses a little too, they aren't willing to take the push unless the final product is completely articulated. And I think that's a fair critique, certainly in poverty space. I think just look at the CARES Act, or not the CARES Act, the act that was just passed. It's going to do a dramatic changes to poverty in our country. And it was not something I anticipated at all. Like, it was just out there. Another example that it doesn't get celebrated enough, but and I like bringing up conservatives, the way that the mortgage income interest deduction was undercut by Trump. Who would have thought, right, that Trump was going to be the one that did that move? Now it's in the larger context, it's a tragedy. But and then the other thing I'd say, just thinking about Tim's talk, and I think it does relate to your question, I think of it, the person I always go to as my person is Jack Knight, who did this great book that Cambridge published, Institutions and Social Conflict. It's slightly different from the way Tim was talking about capture of the politics. His is capture of the background laws, that the laws, in fact, even ones that look neutral, are completely captured. And he looks, at examples, the one that all property people look to is the capture by mining interest in California at the beginning of the state. But we can see it throughout of the capture, even at granule level, not just with day-to-day politics, but the entire system gets captured. So that's all I wanted to say. If you haven't read Jack Knight, I think I am his publicist every time somebody gives me an article. And I think, what should they read to add to their article? It's always Jack Knight in my mind.
What's the name of that book again, Ezra? I'm sorry.
Institutions and Social Conflict. It's Cambridge around 98 or something. I'm not sure.
Oh, thank you.
And unless any of the panelists have any more responses, I am happy to move to some of the first questions in the Q&A. Panelists, anything you want to respond to each other more broadly, unrelated to my question, before I start getting into the specific questions?
Well, I'm happy to respond to your question as well. I was just writing down the title of that book because I haven't read it, and it looks really interesting. So really, what I would tell, or what any of us would tell, aspiring leftist activists, really depends where we're having the discussion, because it will be very different in different places. So I assume that you're coming from an American perspective, and asking what we should tell Americans, in which case I would say the description of the left is, as in disarray, is excessively generous. In comparative terms, I don't see there being a left in the United States. And it's been like that for quite some time. So we're really reinventing the left here almost from scratch. Though, the situation in much of the world is fairly dire as well, because many socialist and social democratic parties, took a wrong turn with the third way, and it turned out to be a dead end. and they have suffered immensely in electoral fortunes for that. And they continue to be. And it's one of the reasons that we're seeing the upsurge in right-wing populism and authoritarianism, because they're filling a vacuum that's been left. And Jamie is absolutely right. This is an ideational struggle first and foremost, because if you look at this in the context of the United States and American society, Americans are very bad at thinking institutionally and politically and thinking historically. And I can't think of two worse characteristics for a society to get out of serious systemic crisis, because you need to think of both. And so framing things in these terms relentlessly is absolutely essential. And if Jed's talking about, we have to ask the question, what do we mean and what do we want when we say democracy? I'm asking questions of what do we mean and what do we want when we talk about power? Because power is located in multiple institutions spanning the public-private divide. They have largely blurred that divide that has always been largely a fiction of liberal political theory, not of liberal political and economic practice. And it's absolutely essential to keep that kind of collapse of public and private in mind when we're thinking about reconstructing a political economic order, because the kind of libertarian ideal and liberal ideal of separate social spheres for public and private is, to my mind, the equivalent of a political theorist's fantasy of the tooth fairy. It doesn't exist, it will not exist. And perpetuating the myth is actively destructive.
That was really helpful. Thank you, John. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to pose first one to John and then one to Jamee, and you guys can answer those in kind, but it's just to save a little bit of time. So for John Cioffi,
Yes.
Consistent with the reference in the definition of spheres, a classic liberal strategy for limiting/managing conflicts of interest is the institutional separation of spheres, often accompanied by appeals to technocracy, whether in law, economics, or science. And lots of examples from Trump era of places in which those barriers were breached in ways that concentrated power. And yet much of LPE critique is devoted to skepticism about those boundaries, and in particular, the desire to assert democratic political control across them. Do you have thoughts about how/whether to reconcile these tendencies? And just for Jamee quickly, question for Professor Moudud about central bank independence, though anyone can answer. Should we shed the veneer of central bank independence and admit to the fundamentally political role that central banks play in nation building? What kind of accountability would you propose for central banks? Do you think they should be subject to direct democratic governance, e.g. we elect governors, closer review from elected officials, some other means, or maybe changing their mandates? And this is a general question, it is noted.
John, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Well, yes, I do have thoughts about that, as a matter of fact. I have many, and I'll restrain myself. So I think two things to keep in mind. As I just said before, the separation of public and private spheres is largely a fiction, and part and parcel of legitimating ideology. Reality deviates considerably from that. So that's a non-response to the problems of power in any modern industrialized political economy. And Trump and his ilk really didn't depart all that substantially from a lot of other conservative political forces in the United States. And those elsewhere, by puncturing the division between public and private. That's a process of collapse that's been ongoing, that has favored corporate interests, financial interests, and the wealthy for decades. Certainly, that's a hallmark of the neoliberal era. And the high dudgeon and offensive people taking issue with this assault on the technocracy, well, in part that's justified, and in part I think it's somewhat opportunistic and self-interested. I mean, I don't have anything against technical expertise. I think it's certainly got its place. I'm not going to go to the my next door neighbor who owns a hair salon for surgery. I also think that expertise in governance really does matter, but it's, as Jamie was saying, embedded in sets of power relations that if you don't deal with them, you have a technocracy that's much more almost inevitably going to be repressive, authoritarian, and will redistribute resources upwards. That's what we're stuck with. So I actually agree with the general LPE critique and skepticism about the boundaries of public and private. You just have to take much more seriously what the interconnections are. So I'll end with this one point that I didn't get to in the presentation, which is when you see conflicts of interest in the public sphere, like politicians dependent on private and corporate campaign contributions, and conflicts of interest in the private sphere, like the structures of the corporation and markets favoring managers and financiers, and they interlink and interact with each other, you get a much more pronounced redistribution of power that benefits both of those parties versus everybody else. So it's that architecture that really matters, and it's that architecture that we really have to think about when we're engaging not only in critical activities but in terms of politics. What do you want? And if you don't know what you want to begin with, you're in trouble, because somebody else will define it for you.
So in terms of central bank independence, on that question, I think that is a big part of our problem, right? And this is a kind of a technocratic category, which is completely out of touch with reality. The critique of central bank independence, I think the best person to go to is John Maynard Keynes, who actually wrote about the fact that the Bank of England should be institutionally separate from, let's say, the Treasury, so that it doesn't become sort of narrowly beholden to whatever the Treasury wants and so on. But at the same time, there has to be a kind of an institutional relationship between Parliament, the executive branch, and the Bank of England. And at the time when he was writing, the BOE was actually a private joint stock corporation, right? Didn't get nationalized in 1945. That it would nonetheless maintaining an institutional separation, it would still be hitched onto the state's development strategies. So there has to be some sort of a way of ensuring democratic control over the process of using the central bank to mobilize finance for economic development, right? Now, oftentimes when you say that, people will fall into this trap of thinking, oh, well, then are you saying that, well, just use the central bank as a piggy bank? And the point that Keynes is making is, no, of course not. There has to be an institutional separation, and we have to think through how to construct that in a way that it maintains a kind of what I call a relative autonomy from the state, but a relative autonomy, because it is absolutely crucial to the mobilization of the entire credit system and the sort of the monetary hardwiring of the economic system. So, on one final note, that in terms of a left strategy, I feel like that's where one of the things has to go to, which is the question of the monetary hardwiring of the economic system, public banking, and so forth, as a crucial lever of power. Yeah, we're going to provide you with funding. You meaning the corporations and so on. Here is the quid pro quo. You outsource, you pay back this money with compound interest. Let's see how far you go, right? I'm not saying, look, I'm not being naive here. I'm not saying that that's, but I'm saying that that's the kind of hardball tactic that's got to be used. And so I'm actually all for using extremely hardball tactics in terms of, mobilizing to discipline capital, but being mindful of the point that Tim pointed out, which I think is very important, which is that it ain't so simple because there's so much power on the other side against it. But at least conceptually, that's the way I'm thinking about this.
Well, thank you all so much. It looks like we're at time, and also like the last question has already been answered. Just wanted to one more time flag next Thursday's event on March 25th, Revival and Renewal of Marxist Approaches. It'll be at the same time as this event. Thank you all so much for bringing such great questions. Yeah, thank you to our wonderful panelists. This has been a really illuminating and important conversation, and I look forward to more events.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Hey all.
You did an excellent job, Lily. Thank you.
Should we stop?
Yeah, well done, Lily.
Should we stop the recording?
We're the only ones in. Oh yeah. We stopped the recording.
I got it.